You're probably well familiar with the term intermittent fasting or periodic fasting, and you've probably read a book or 10 about it, and you've probably heard about it in the media and the news, and you might have tried it yourself, and you may have even already recommended people do versions of it. And intermittent fasting has become something of a borderline fad over the past 10 years, really. However, there is some really good science in there as well. As long as we stick to what the science tells us and what the research confirms us of, we can actually get some real benefit, and we can also bring it into people's lives in a far more realistic way that's sustainable for life, for the long term, rather than it being something whereby, you know, a person is living by this almost ridiculous structure of life whereby there are literally days every single week that they don't consume any kind of foods. And it takes a crazy narrative, it takes crazy tales where people start to go back in time, you know, over millennia, to talk about mankind foraging off the ground to say this is what we did. We don't need to bother with any of that kind of nonsense to justify the good science, and there is good science in it. And basically, you know, if we look at the mechanism of play of what's going on, well, we know that when we consume foods, particularly carbohydrates, that they get broken down. You know, enzymes in the gut break that down. That becomes molecules in the blood. And what happens is that in order for sugars to get into the cell to be used as a energy source, then we need an increase of insulin. And it's that increase in insulin that brings the sugar into the cell. And anything that's not used as energy, well, that gets stored as fat. So there is probably the most simplistic way I can describe how that mechanism works with regards to how we consume the foods, how that enters the bloodstream, and how that ends up being stored as fat. So long as there is sufficient time between meals and we're not snacking, and those insulin levels are allowed to fall and drop and lower, then typically there is sufficient time for that energy within the cell to be used and released. And we don't store fat, and we don't store excessive amounts of fat or unnecessary amounts of fat. And that's a good cycle. That's a relatively healthy cycle. The problem we've got in 21st century is people eat continuously. People eat a lot. A part of our overconsumption, which adds to that whole debate of calories in versus calories out, is that the average person, you know, tends to start to eat more. And no one became obese overnight. And it's not about somebody suddenly going from a calorifically suitable diet to suddenly adding an extra 500 or 600 or 1000 kcal per day. That happens over time. People grade towards those more excessive intakes. And the body, as you're aware, homeostasis, physiology 101, is quite finely balanced, really. So if we do overconsume, or if we don't allow those insulin levels to fall, i.e. we snack too often, you know, we continue our grazing, then those insulin levels remain high, and therefore there is constantly a code, in effect, telling the cell to store those sugars, and they store those sugars as fats. So there's a bit of an insight under the hood as to what goes on. You probably knew everything that I've just said, and if not, if you didn't know it the way I've just explained it, you probably had a basic idea or even a more deeper understanding of the mechanism of play. But let's get real about that then. The problem is that there's insufficient time between eating opportunities, bouts of eating, for insulin levels to lower, and also people's extended time across a day at which they are continually eating. So people with busy lives, they're getting up in the morning, they could be having their breakfast at 0600 hours, so 6 a.m. in the morning. That might be when we switch on the metabolic clock. So it's breakfast, coffee, bum, 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 on the go. So we've started, our window has opened. And then they might get to their place of work and have another tea or a coffee. These are metabolically active things. They might have a biscuit with that. They might have a piece of fruit. They might then have a snack mid-morning, then they go for their lunch, then they might have a mid-afternoon snack, they might have a couple more teas, coffees, particularly if those are kind of coffees that are based on milk. They're decidedly metabolically active, high in lactose if they're having lattes, flat whites, cappuccinos, mochas. All these kind of things are keeping that cycle of metabolic activity high, insulin levels raising to deal with that food as it comes through the gut, Those enzymes are actively engaging, boom, boom, boom. That cycle we discussed a moment ago, that's continually going on. Then they go home, they may well exercise, whatever, but they'll have their evening meal. And then what we see is that as we get later on, most people report that later in the evening, when watching television or whatever it is they do, they might have another snack of some type. And then by the time they go to bed, let's say they go to bed at 10, half past 10 in the evening, 30, 100 hours, someone has been eating for a period way in excess of, they've been metabolically active through the gut, way in excess of 12, 14, 16 hours. So that's a big part of the mechanism of the problem. It's a big part of the mechanism of the problem with regards to overeating, so excessive calorie consumption, but also with regards to the impact it has on the system that has to deal with it. It's working for a long time. So the fundamental principle behind intermittent fasting or periodic fasting is about compressing that time, so limiting those times at which we're metabolically active and those insulin levels are raised. More importantly, extending the time at which insulin levels are lowered or lowering, and enabling the cell to use that sugar as energy and therefore not store it as fat. But that's only one part of the magic at play, because what we're seeing through the better research is that we're seeing things like, heat shock protein profile, and these are the things that really protect the body and look at DNA repair and gene expression. Well, they become more active, and we start to see a shift towards a physiological, a health environment that is less aligned to risk of chronic disease and illness. And the research in this area is going on, and there's some really good work coming out each and every week. But we do know that the early signs are really, really positive. And this aligns to the body's synchronicity with circadian rhythmicity. We are designed as a species to be diurnal, i.e. active during the day. We're meant to eat during the day, not at night time. As and when it goes dark, and this is now, if you want to troll back through millennia and bring in some gloopy story from our primordial days, well, this is it really. We are a diurnal species. That's what we've evolved on this planet to do. When it's dark, we take refuge, we hide, we wait for the sun, and we get back out there and start living again. And what's happened now, because of modern life and modern convention, is we're eating when it's dark, and because of work demands, expectations on the clock, we've changed our eating habits around that. So if we take the best principles of that and we recognize that we are meant to fast overnight, and the best research currently, and most of the research looks at the fasting window as anything from 12 hours really to 48, and you'll see a lot of work that focuses in on that 16-hour window. And really there's almost a magic moment around this 16 hours where we optimize our return, particularly from an oxidative fat point of view, i.e. insulin levels being sufficiently low so that the cell releases those sugars and doesn't store them as fat, and especially so with regards to these changes we see in heat shock proteins and the body's defense system and the immune system bolstering itself, and we see a lowering of systemic inflammation. Typically happens around the 16-hour mark, but we see some other changes even in a shorter window than that. But we can embrace this as a part of everyday life. So there are a couple of steps that are a bit more, for want of a better word, serious than others, but there are things that we can do that are quite contained. Now, there's some really good research that says if 2 or 3 times a week, you are containing your eating within an 8-hour window. So that would be, having breakfast at 7 and then, being finished by 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Then we see a lot of these, big benefits that can be had. And that's really compressing things down into that window to fit specifically, which aligns perfectly to that 16. Another way to do that, actually, which I've found to be more effective, is to get somebody 2 or 3 times a week to stop their eating at 6 o'clock at night. Take advantage of the evening, the nighttime fast because they're asleep, and offset the breakfast the next day till 10 a.m. So therefore we've brought in that 16-hour window again. So we can really implement this in ways of strategies that can be quite easy to bring into it, even though the time itself might seem quite extreme or restrictive. What has been proven not to work, and it doesn't matter how many million copies of the books have been sold and all the rest of it, for most people, for most people, and they're the people we're going to work with, they're the people we do work with, is this notion of saying 48 hours. You know, you're not going to eat for 48 hours, you're going to fast for 48 hours. And there are even some now which fit more into the periodic fasting, where they're saying to people, you know, you eat normally for 2 or 3 weeks and then you have a 5-day fast. These things, for the average Western industrialized civilian member of society, are just too extreme, unsustainable, and what it leads towards is cravings. And the minute a person starts to, you know, be subject to cravings, then you've lit the fuse. It's only a matter of time before they start to go against it, because their cravings are overwhelming, and they'll either start to consume more of the foods that we're trying to educate them to avoid or minimize or eliminate altogether, or they'll just break the cycle because it was never achievable for them. And why would we? Because the best science, and I encourage you to go and have a look at the Harvard Medical School, go and have a look across the research literature through the techniques that we've already shown you how to do across this program. Go and have a look in those areas and you will see that the best evidence says that that 16-hour fast window provides all the same benefits as doing those more extreme versions. So why would you do something more extreme? We would never do that in any other scenario. As exercise specialists, we are always looking for the biggest return for the least investment. So if I could get the strongest chest in the world just by bench pressing 20 kilograms, that's what I'm going to do. If that's going to give me the strongest chest in the world, if there was a way to set the reps and the sets around that and the intensity, and that would give me the strongest chest ever, why would I be interested in trying to attempt 100 kilograms or 120 or 150 kilograms? That would be an insane idea. So why would we apply that to our food behavior? You know, food is something we engage with every single day. It's a huge part of our lives. It's what gives us sustenance and keeps us alive. Our relationships with food are overwhelming. So if we're going to get someone onto a better relationship, it has to be a relationship that will work for the long term, that gives all the benefits, all the romance and whiz of that big exciting relationship, but in a sustainable, meaningful way, that we get all the good stuff without having to dramatically convert our lifestyle so that we're at odds with the majority of society, or at odds with how we've been brought up so dramatically. So let's get real about that. There is a benefit to the principles of intermittent fasting, and they align themselves to our human nature. One is to prevent us from having a metabolic window that's open for too long, you know, that we're allowing insulin levels to fall and go low so that the cell can do what it needs to do. We align ourselves with what we are, you know, pre-programmed, evolution has pre-programmed us to do, which is to fast overnight time. Perfectly tied into our circadian rhythmicity. We don't eat over that time. We take advantage of the best of what the science can tell us right now, which is to invoke these 16-hour windows 2 or 3 times a week. You know, and the rest of the time we can fall into a more typical pattern of eating behavior. But really, with a bit of a kind of notion of working towards containing those nighttime eating periods. You know, that can be a part of our longer term strategy. One of the things I do want to caution you about as you go towards maybe refining your approach to intermittent fasting or bringing it in for the first time is make sure it doesn't simply become a way to restrict calories. So on those days where food behavior is going to be contained within, let's say, 8 hours, we still want to make sure that the person is getting sufficiently fueled, because there's no reason on those days that they're not going to be at work and meeting all the demands that they need to meet in their lives, and going to the gym and exercising with you and doing things that are physically demanding and raising heart rate and everything else, and having to be cognitively active, task orientated, fulfilling their role in life and doing their job, everything. And also they may well be on that day recovering from an exercise bout they did the day before or 2 days before, or setting themselves up for a bout of exercise and activity they're going to do the next day. So we don't want that to be a calorifically impoverished day. That's not what intermittent fasting is about. And actually, when you look across the history of intermittent fasting, where you've seen the radical weight loss stories, typically it's because it's another dramatic calorie restriction method, i.e. you don't have as long to eat, so a person ends up eating less. That's not where the kind of beauty and benefit of intermittent fasting lies. It's far more specific than that. It's far more meaningful. You know, there's far more going on physiologically, biochemically, than just starving someone of calories. So in that 8-hour day, you know, we don't want to make someone gorge for 8 hours, and we shouldn't have to, because the average person is going to be on, an energy intake, even if we just look at it from that point of view, of around about anywhere from, whether it's male or female, let's say 1900 calories to about 2.5 for the average person. I know there'll be exceptions to that, and I can hear people shouting through the screen to me now about that person they work with who's on 3000, or that person who can only function on 15. Let's just go with the average, around about 18 to about 2.5. When we break that down into about 5 meals, that's quite easy to achieve in reality. And we can even allow for the fact that we still want to put those fibrous carbs in. They might have at least 1 or 2 snacks that are maybe a piece of fruit, whatever that's going to be. That's quite easy to achieve across 8 hours. That's not, the only reason why we'd think that is difficult to achieve is because we've kind of acclimatized to an environment where we've got that extended period. But it's not that difficult to achieve whatsoever. There's no reason why we should starve someone of calories on those 8-hour days. And remember, we're not looking for dramatic shifts in insulin response on the 8-hour day, because it's the fasting window. It's that time that we're not metabolically active. That's what's going to give us that lowering of insulin. That's what's going to give us that, real turnover and change in heat shock protein production. That's what's going to bolster our DNA. That's what's going to change gene expression, is that 16-hour fast period, not the 8-hour that we're metabolically active. A couple of other cautions to throw in, which I've already alluded to. Other than water, everything else we typically engage with from a food and drink point of view is metabolically active. So it's going to prompt an enzyme response from the body. So when we're in the fast phase, so if we're going to go from that 1800 hours of an evening, well, then the only thing that gets past our lips at that point is water, because anything else will be metabolically active. It will create an enzymatic response. It will engage the gut, the gut biome, the flora within the gut. So we're going to avoid that. It's just water. That's what we get through. So we're not going to sneak anything through, because otherwise we're not fasting and we're not actually fulfilling that requirement of reaching the 16-hour. Again, there are some papers that have said, we can achieve a really good response. Whether or not it's optimal, we can achieve a really good response and a big improvement off a 12-hour. So maybe that's where you start. Maybe not going for the 16 hours 2 to 3 times a week is the start point. Maybe the way to start to introduce this with your client and the person you're working with is to start with a 12-hour, which is actually quite simple, which is where you'd say after 7 o'clock in the evening, you're not going to eat, and you can have your breakfast at 7 o'clock in the morning the next day. That actually aligns itself with what you might call normal, for want of a better word. And that might be where you bring this practice in, and then you start to, manipulate those variables as they start to get set and build some success off achieving that. You might start with 1 to 2 a week, get into 3 times a week on a 12-hour window, and then it might be a case of going, well, one of our windows is going to be 16, the other 2 are going to be 12, build up to 2 16s and 1 12, until you can get to that optimal kind of 3 times a week, 16-hour window. Each individual will vary in how they, comply to it, and how much they embrace it, and how difficult it is for them to bring it into their lives. But what we do know is that the science around it is good, and the science around it is stacking up, and the science around it is telling us, don't do the extreme stuff, the 5-2, all that crazy stuff. Just do the stuff that we can implement. The final word on this is that the science also says that there is a dramatic difference if we just achieve this once a week. We get massive immediate health benefits, physical benefits, physiological benefits, even if we can only do it once a week. So we're on to a winner. We've got our optimal that we might want to aim for, but we also know that for the majority of us, if we can just get this in as a 1 time a week phenomena that we get to, and we can stick with that, then we are going to see huge, measurable, positive changes to our health status, and it's going to help us to manage things around managing our weight.